And hello there from the IBHS studios here in Richburg, South Carolina. I'm going to be your host for today, Sarah Dillingham, and welcome to the IBHS Disaster Discussions podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to have another great discussion here, and we're going to be keeping our focus on wildfire. If you missed last month's episode, we focused on the Lahaina wildfires that devastated that community on the island of Maui. We're going to be monitoring that here at the lab over the next couple of months, really, as this event kind of transpires. But today we're going to be talking to another guest who's also heavily involved in the wildfire space. And right now, I just want to send a warm welcome to Yana Valachovic. She is joining us today. So Yana, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Sure. Well, you were a good friend of ours here at IBHS. I was able to meet you in person just last year as you came to visit with our researchers and do some presentations of your own there, sharing some of your work. And I know that you've, as we'll reference some of that work today, you have been involved with some of our researchers in the past, Steve Quarles, his name will come up a couple times. So it's really nice to be able to have our friends join us on the podcast and share the message of mitigation and resilience. And so, yeah, without any further ado, we'll just kind of get right into it. So Yana, as I learned a little bit about you here when you came here, really quick, I want to ask, what was that visit like for you? That was the first time that you've been to the lab, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, to be honest, it was a real honor. I mean, I've been following your work at IBHS for, several years, and to finally have the opportunity to see the size and scale of the lab. And I happened to be in South Carolina on one of the days that you all were conducting one of the experiments related to the question about separation of structures to structures and what was the impact of an ignited shed and the radiant heat that gave off from that shed onto a adjacent building. And so it was real fun just to get to see how that works in action and get to feel the cold morning gusts, from the wind turbine, which were substantially colder than I was anticipating, to be honest. I think I was there about actually almost a year to date, really, when I think about it. And so it was just really fun to get to see that in action and watch the countdown of the experiment and see the whole team that puts an event on and helps give us really relevant information, which I often use in my outreach and extension work as an extension agent to communicate to the general public about the challenges of the day. So, to have my hand in it, at least for one day, was a great privilege.
Yeah, and that was great. And you're bringing back memories. I know we have our another phase of our structure separation testing going on. It's now wind-driven building to building fire spread is what we're looking at now, because we're kind of seeing how that wind and fire impact or interact with the built environment. So yeah, as you said, we were doing some of that testing last summer and fall, and we did see it. Noting that you're talking about how cold the fans are. I'm not a person who likes cold very much, so in the summer it's great when you've got those fans blowing, you get a little bit of that breeze. But when it's winter time and the fans are turned on, it can be quite frigid and you've got a layer up. So I can definitely relate to that. So yeah, that's bringing back some memories for me. But yeah, we're going to be continuing that testing. We've already had a couple more burns earlier this summer. We're going to be picking those up again into the fall, and then a whole nother phase kicks off next year. So stay tuned to that. I'm sure we'll have our researchers talking about that at some point there. So as you mentioned, you're doing a lot of work out in the field, and I kind of want to label off a little bit about your background, but I also want to hear from you and kind of like how you came into these roles and how you kind of got involved to what you're doing. So you're currently at the University of California working cooperative extension forest advisor. You have a Master's of Science in Forest Science from Oregon State University, and you're co-lead of the Northern California region of the California Fire Science Consortium, and you're a steering committee member of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council. So doing some cool stuff, Yana. So I'm curious, like as a meteorologist, if you ask meteorologists, like, how did you get into the business? And it's usually going to be some weather event that kicked off our interest. And then we just knew from the start that we were going to do meteorology at that point. But I'm curious for you, what was it that really got you involved in this field? Was there sort of a spark like that?
Yeah. Well, it's not a simple story, actually, but I'll do my best. I was raised off the grid. I'm gonna really credit that as part of who I am and how I think about the issues that we work on, which meant that I, had a very hands-on application to maintaining buildings, maintaining water systems, dealing with electricity systems. We had solar, and so I've always had my hands, in the ground, so to speak, or in the wood, so to speak, and so that influenced me quite a bit. I probably should have become an architect. That probably would have been a better a better pathway for
Yeah.
me. But I'm a nerdy scientist. I love to think about how ecosystems work and how pattern and process come together. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I do a lot of career counseling, and I can tell you that no one enters college with a career trajectory figured out for the majority of the time. We often just follow our nose and end up in random places. So I went away to college, and I happened to live in Oakland during a break that I took, and I was there during the Oakland Hills Fire in 1991. So that
was a
is
big one.
somewhat of a game-changing event. My dad also started a wildfire accidentally with using a weed whacker with a metal blade. So those were two kind of, I mean, we could shine a light on both of those events. So I experienced wildfire, and then I experienced very destructive, kind of urban wildfire. And given that background and that sort of interest in design and interest in systems, I was a forester by training, and I found myself in a very lucky place in that I'm a nerdy scientist, but I like people a lot, and I managed to land a job as an extension agent, which really is in that, you've got your feet in many worlds. You're working in the research application side, but you're trying to solve relevant problems for the communities that you serve. So in my system, I'm based in a kind of a geographic area where I serve a really diverse clientele of scientists and managers and community members and policymakers, and in extension, we have the ability to evolve our career and take on different topical areas. So I've had many chapters of my career. And then we often, try and extend information around new ideas, things that are important, things that we should track. And so we were fortunate at the time when I started Extension that Dr. Steve Quarles, who later became one of your primary scientists, worked for Extension, and he was working in the wildfire space. And so, he came up to the communities that I worked with, and we did some great things. Like we actually did experiments in the parking lot where we could construct different wall assembly units and ignite them in the parking lot and like do things that are pretty complicated to pull off.
We're still doing that now.
Right? But we struggled to get an audience. People were really in the early 2000s kind of not so interested in, at least the communities that I worked in this wildfire issue and in the built environment issue, even though Steve was working directly and trying to develop new code and develop a new system based on the experience of the Oakland Hills Fire in 1991, because that really changed how California thought about wildfire, and that became really the catalyst for the Chapter 7A building code for that's specific to the exterior performance of the building respective to wildfire. So
and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, anyway, so I started working with Steve, and we wrote a couple publications together, and then he retired. He retired from Extension and went to work for you all and continued the work. And so I would keep calling Steve and be like, well, what are you learning? What's new? What's happening? And so I kept trying to keep the thoughts alive. But the main game-changing event for me was really the Tubbs Fire of 2017 and the whole North Bay Complex fires, which hit from Mendocino County through Sonoma County into Napa. And I think we were all just captivated by the enormity of the issue. And I remember looking at the filming that was coming through the media, and what did I see? What I saw was that there were green trees throughout a landscape, and there were lost homes. And it really brought home this idea that our homes are the most combustible part of the landscape. And I thought, I got to get there. I got to figure out how to get some drone footage. I need some of that footage for my own work. And I was able to work with our UC teams. We got drones on the ground. We got behind, the lines and got in, and so that was the first time I, tried to pull off a post-fire investigation on my own, and brought a couple other folks along with me, and that just launched us deep into the wildfire space. And that's where I've been really ever since.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great story. And, you brought up a point about the Oakland Hills fire, and that was something that really kind of changed people's perception across the state of California about wildfire. It wasn't that I don't think the state acted like we have like wildfires are not a threat at all. But when you see something like that happen, and to your point also about the Tubbs fire, how it was really captivating, how I believe you said that the structure was the most combustible thing in the landscape. Like, how do we determine that? And, here at IBHS, we're still doing those kinds of damage surveys, because even though we can do great research here at the lab and repeat that and do that with full scale structures, it is challenging to try and mimic what a real fire, how that unfolds and how that evolves in a community. And so being able to get those boots on the ground and to see those elements up close and trying to figure out exactly what was the evolution, what was the pathway for fire through those communities, it can really be impactful. So as you kind of set that up there with the Oakland fire in the state of California, we've seen the issues of wildfires become really, California is the epicenter of wildfires, right? It kind of used to be earthquakes. We had some of those major earthquakes in the 1990s, and then we kind of shifted now to where fire is one of the biggest things that we're worried about. And across the state of California, we've seen I believe around 10 to 20 of the largest wildfires in just the last 10 years or so impacting the state. A couple of those we're going to talk about today, and the Tubbs fire is certainly one of those. But we're really kind of at an existential crisis, we feel like, across the state, where wildfire is in a lot of our communities. It's something that we're living with wildfire now, and it seems like we've had to learn really fast about how to try and make a meaningful change now. And so with that, I kind of want to see a little bit, let's talk about, I'm curious what your view is on kind of the climate impacts of this, because we know with climate change, we've got this warmer environment that's going to make evaporation of soil moisture and fuel moisture that much more rapid, essentially, so where we can have these times of heat and drought develop. How have you been seeing that develop across the landscape, and how it relates to fires that you've covered?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if I could back up for just a second, one of the things that I think was so significant about the Tubbs fire is that it put another fire back in Northern California. And until the Oakland Hills fire, most of our wildland fires that had fairly substantial impact to human communities have been in Southern California, and they've been in those shrub and chaparral systems. And so, you can have a perception that that's a problem of somewhere else as opposed to a problem of where you are. And, both Oakland and then the Tubbs fire, and then, what sequences right after that is the Carr fire in Redding in 2018. You get the Camp Fire later that year in 2018. And then, all bets are off at that point, where I think we, as residents of California, really have begun to recognize that, it can happen just about everywhere, and maybe there really isn't a safe zone within the landscape. So, coming back to your question around climate and how does climate and the, are we in an anomalous period? Are we in a new normal? Or, what do we call this? I think that the real issue is that we've gone through some pretty historic droughts during this time period. But we're also seeing warmer nighttime temperatures, which means that you don't get moisture recovery at night. The Carr fire, which is, for those of you who don't follow the names of all these fires, is probably best known because it hit the communities of Redding, and it had that massive fire tornado associated with it.
Yes.
And, I keep thinking about that and like King Kong, like, okay, if you got a fire tornado, you clearly need King Kong to try and come in and like save us from these great calamities. But what was happening in the Carr fire was that really we weren't getting any nighttime humidity recovery. Nighttime temperatures were hotter. And so everything was just exceptionally cured. We see that again in the lightning series that hit in 2020 that came up through Santa Cruz County, up through the South Bay and into kind of the North Bay, and that kicks off, including the August fire, which becomes California's largest fire on record, which is the Million Acre Fire. Those lightning events happen right on top of an extreme drying hot time period. So, we have exceptionally dry conditions. We have low, moisture content in plants overall. So those are fueling those specific events, but then we're also seeing kind of expansion of the fire season into what we used to call the shoulder seasons, like fires are occurring earlier in the spring, like the coastal fire in 2022, I believe it is. And then, later into the fall, you get the Thomas fire. So there's not a sense of what the true fire season is anymore. And we can be in condition to burn in many locations in the state in times when, maybe that's not the frame of normal for us. So, there's a lot of interaction that's happening between, our overall weather conditions, the amount of available soil moisture, the plant moisture availability, and, concurrently kind of the weather dynamics, which are certainly accelerating the complexity of challenge that we face right now.
Yeah, and you really hit that right on the ingredients. The ingredients are there where we have, and California is one of those places where, from a meteorological standpoint, as a meteorologist myself, we know that they can go and see one extreme to the other, right? Earlier this year, we actually had an episode with Dr. Ian Giamenko where we talked about some of the wild weather of this year that we saw really across the United States. And it started in the West where we had, I believe, 9 atmospheric river events. And so when you see these events, you're like, oh, that's so great. They're getting the much needed rainfall. Now, unfortunately, that comes with the flooding, which that's not the good part. We don't want to see that. But when you do get these beneficial rains, you're like, oh, this is great for the drought. However, what that is eventually going to do is grow vegetation. Well, when the next heat wave comes and the next drought comes, we just know that whatever vegetation is able to grow, those fuels are then going to dry out and unfortunately be sitting there waiting for whatever that spark may be, whether that may be lightning or a man-made cause. I mean, man-made sparks, as we'll call them, are kind of drive some of the larger fires that we've seen. But we've got these lightning events that can create that spark. And then once we've got the ingredients already in place, that's really all we need to kind of get these large fires developing. And sometimes they turn into these conflagrations in places like Paradise, California. And then you're kind of left to pick up the pieces and struggling to see how can we learn from this event? How can we try and prevent this in the future? And we've kind of talked around this a little bit now, talking about how people perceive fire. Let's talk about how people perceive risk to something, because before I got to IBHS, in the broadcast community, we're talking to people about trying to prepare ahead of weather events. And that includes fires, where fires are different in the sense that it's not one of those things. You might have fire weather conditions set up, but you're not necessarily going to get a fire. If I'm forecasting for a tropical cyclone to make landfall somewhere, the tropical cyclone is going to make landfall wherever you're talking to. But with wildfire, it's a little bit different. You're kind of preparing for if something happens, we have to go. But I think it's difficult for people to try and understand what their risk actually is to something, and thus how to respond to it. So I'm curious, how do you kind of perceive people and their understanding about wildfire risk? And I know you like to ask people this question: where are you going to be when wildfire strikes, right? And so I think I'm interested how those two play together.
So you've seen enough of my talks then to know that's where I often start. That's nice. Well, I think it's a really important question, because most people perceive they're going to be home when the ignition occurs, and they've got this set of actions in their mind that they're going to take, and they're like, first thing, I'm going to close the doors, I'm going to close the windows, I'm going to close the skylight, I'm going to go through this logical plan, I'm going to put my go bag in the car, I'm going to do these things, and in reality, they're in town or they're somewhere else, and they didn't leave their home and condition to be, safe. They left the windows open, they left the skylight open, or one of the other key things they may have done. I think people, we live in California. There's so many hazards in everyday life, right? In California, you have no idea when the next earthquake's going to strike. So you just put that out of your mind and you hope you've done the best you can. But, have you strapped the bookshelves to the wall so that if they fall over, they don't crush you? I mean, there's certain things you can try and do to anticipate, protecting your family. There's some, additional strapping you can do if you are on, a foundation that's not a perimeter foundation, but there's not a lot you can do. In the fire space, I think we're gaining more situational awareness, I might call it, more ability to recognize when we are in critical fire weather conditions. We understand red flag warnings a little better, but we're often in dry, low humidity conditions for long time periods. And so you get kind of numb to that environment. And, you hope that things will go well that day, but you can't anticipate that they will. So, I'm trying to spend a lot of time talking to communities and talking to families around the choices you make and trying to set yourself up for the best possible outcome, and to have a different scenarios to work for. I mean, I think
Mhm.
we build a typical scenario and we hope that it lays out in the way that we think it will, and we think we've anticipated all the needs. But in reality, what you're hoping is that you've done as best you can, but it's always going to be more complex or different than we anticipate. And
Yeah.
I mean, as a great illustration, like the town of Paradise had done a lot of planning for wildfire, and they had experienced a lot of wildfires coming from the west. They
Mhm.
didn't quite have as much planning about a wildfire coming from the east. And so,
Mhm.
you don't always get the fire you've had in the past. So becoming more nimble, and becoming more prepared is critical. This last year, in relation to the Lahaina fires, I answered this question several times
Yeah.
about, why do we need some kind of siren system that seems like antiquated, outdated technology? And
Mhm.
to me, it's a really good reminder that you need multiple forms of communication. You need to understand
Absolutely.
multiple forms of communication. We have lots more, technological abilities. We can use all kinds of apps these days, which are going to try and tell us which
Mhm.
way we should evacuate. But in my experience, we often have, low bandwidth. We may not have power at all. And so we
Mhm.
need many different ways for people to be prepared and for information to be relayed. And people have, different levels of fluency with different kinds of technology, and so we've got to do a multiple methods at all times
Mhm.
type approach. And the siren system for me is kind of base. It means something is going wrong. Step outside and pay attention, right? Then
Right.
hopefully you can kick in some other
Mhm.
senses of interpretation of what
Mhm.
might be going.
Yeah, you're right. We talk about that with other perils here from our science communications arm and preparedness for the out ahead of a weather event. We tell people that all the time: have multiple ways to get warnings, have multiple ways to get information, because we do have a lot coming at us, and there you might need a diverse set of communication tools so that if one fails or one is having difficulty, you have other options. And we understand as well, it's also difficult to with all that information, it can be difficult to filter that information. Like, okay, which pieces
Mm-hmm.
of information do I need to pull down and which ones do I need to use to make a decision and make a good decision now to try and escape or evacuate, or get out, whatever the case may be. And that can be challenging in and of itself, especially with the day of social media and everything at our fingertips.
Mm-hmm. Right, right, exactly. And I just you can't design a system that's going to work for everybody everywhere all the
Mm,
time, right? And so you
right.
need many, many, many ways. And so, like when the Tubbs fire ignited, um, there were multiple power lines that were down across California. One of those wildfires that ignited was also in a little community called Redwood Valley, which was on the
Mm,
north end, north of a town called Ukiah. And the only form of communication that was working that night was the radio. And
mm,
people, the system was so much unfolding in real time with so little information because the ignitions happened at night and you couldn't get eyes on it. And it was a really fantastic reminder that you need multiple ways for evacuation. You need
mm,
multiple routes out, and you may have to use the one that you never intended. So I think that's all a part of becoming more nimble and more skilled in having to think through and walk through these experiences. And
mm.
um, it's hard stuff too. I mean, because it's scary for kids, and it's
Yeah.
scary for parents, um, and it's the kinds of things that you just sort of never want to do.
Mm,
And it takes a lot, like for a municipality, to actually practice an evacuation at scale and make it fun enough that people are willing to do it. And
mm,
I've got a great little story from one of the communities in Santa Cruz. They're a small little fire safe council, and they have one of
mm.
the CERT teams, which is a community emergency response team.
Right.
And this community is practicing using their ham radios and trying to, 'cause they get shut off from communication. And so
Mm.
they've been doing treasure hunts with the kids, and they've been doing adults
Wow.
against kids in using radios and radio communication. and doing these treasure hunts as a way to get familiar with how to use a radio. And I'm thinking, no, this is exactly the level. This is what adaptation looks like. This means
Right.
you're bringing in everyone at every level. You're making it fun, and you're figuring out ways that you can work through difficult situations, and you're practicing in a way that's not scary, so that when and if the real event happens, you're prepared.
Right, right. Yeah. And it's that creative skills and that we need to really develop and import into our science communication and trying to figure out how we get those messages to people in a way that they can understand. And you and I will get a little bit more into kind of the messaging and some of your work with boots on the ground, some of those efforts there here in just a minute. But, really quick, we talked about with California having seen a lot of changes over the last in decades of California. There have been a variety of different legislations passed that have focused around wildfire, and I believe you've been involved in some of those legislative efforts. But I did notice kind of roughly over the last 20 years or so, we've had about 5 different types of legislation that have been passed, but if we go all the way back to 1965, between that time period before, there were only 4 maybe throughout that entire time frame. So I think that might be another cue where we talked about already that people's perception of wildfire has changed. So can you share a little bit about some of those processes that you've been involved in?
Yeah, it's a big topic. So my role is really to translate science to policy and try and make it understandable. And so I often serve as a technical resource for legislators or their aides. And, after the Tubbs fire, there was so much interest in how do we solve this problem, from the utility scale, ignition point, to evacuations, to warnings, to how do we get funding on the ground to help harden our communities? How do we get into the planning space? How do we think about it from a land use planning perspective? To, are there barriers in our review of fuel treatments that we need to alleviate? California's a highly regulated state, and for listeners coming across from other parts of the United States, we are our own unique beast in that way, and it's very complex. So, what dials do we turn? How much effort do we put? You can use policy to create funding streams. You can use policy to create regulatory changes. You can use policy to create organizational changes. And we've just seen hundreds and hundreds of bills to try and do that. And many of them have been successful. I think that the ones that I'm particularly excited about are a couple. And let me just back up. Also, we've done massive work in the prescribed fire space and really tackled that issue head on and changed liability standards, created insurance pools, created better standards for qualifications and other folks to become qualified to do prescribed fire work. So, myself and a whole network of folks are really trying to take an overall systems viewpoint and try and address the challenges and work with our legislative partners to try and really tackle these issues in as best of possible way. And I think we're going to be a very different state in a few years once all these things come into play. The pieces that I've had the strongest hand in have been in changes related to defensible space policy in California. So we got into defensible space work. So that's, fuel modification in and around the home to prevent wildfire from driving directly to the house or from the house igniting and then sending wildfire out to the wildland. But that has evolved in thinking in large part from work that's taken place at the IBHS lab to realize more levels of attention and detail to the fuels adjacent to the home are just so critical for being able to manage the threat of embers landing on the vegetation or the fuels that might be surrounding the building in a moat of flammability that I often think about. So California's upgrading the defensible space policies to include a new zone, which is the first 5 feet, 0 to 5. We've commonly referred to that as Zone 0 in California because we already had zones 1 and 2. I've also been involved in a bill called AB 38, which had multiple intentions. One was to try and secure funds to be able to put investment into a number of communities to be able to see if we can uplift in the home hardening and defensible space way for those that are most vulnerable. And so there are 3 pilot communities that's being worked on right now, and 3 more are joining. So it's kind of a partnership between the federal folks using FEMA money as well as some state money to try and deliver that. So it's going to be interesting to see, after these couple thousand homes get evaluated and changed, what impact that makes. But AB 38 also has 2 other really interesting components. One is a disclosure process at the real estate transaction point. And I bring this forward because this is the time period when people are least attached to what happens at the home. The seller is motivated to sell and the buyer is motivated to buy. And at that point, you care less about exactly what vegetation is where. And so AB 38 now requires a disclosure to the future buyer about the defensible space work that's occurred. And, as I think about that moving forward, I think it's going to be a really relevant negotiating point. And it becomes this point of, well, how do we upgrade the condition of the home so that it's going to be robust to this set of fuel-related risks. What's coming in 2025 is also a component related to the home hardening work that's a part of that original bill. So, at a statewide level, this is a broad brush approach to really begin to inform folks at the point of transaction, what the hazards are and how to, mitigate some of those hazards. And I think that will be a great stimulus for, managing our existing, structures that we have. We can change policy around how we build and where we build, but that isn't the majority of homes that we're going to have in California going forward. We have this, existing set of constructed buildings that we need to address. So I bring those 2 forward as, I think, really pivotal changes in how we're addressing these fire issues.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned those. That those are a couple that I'm familiar with. In my time here at IBHS, and we talked about this from a mitigation standpoint in the real estate. We actually had a past episode where we addressed some of these issues. We kind of talked more about our fortified program, which is our wind and hail mitigation program. We have Wildfire Prepared Home, which is our wildfire mitigation designation program that we recently launched last year. And so it's talking about things like, when you're buying a house, you take a look at these MLS, these multiple listing services, and your realtor's going through and they're looking at all these different assets that are on a home, looking at all the different attributes, and you're saying, oh, okay, this one has some new features. They just redid the kitchen, or they just replaced the roof or replaced the HVAC and that kind of thing. But things like, do they have a fortified roof? In this case, do they have, when's the last time the defensible space was addressed here? So it's kind of getting them started off on the right foot when the transaction is made. That I think that's a great point that you made there. And it's ultimately, we would want to get that into just a regular part, like rather than just being an extra add comment on the MLS for that particular property. It's going to be something that's come standard on there. Is this mitigated? Defensible space check. Does it pass all these guidelines? Because at the end of the day, that's how we're going to make the biggest change going forward with some of these, certainly with new homes, right? As we get to build better from the start. But to your point, we have a lot of infrastructure that's already built, and we are going to have to mitigate that. And so I think it's everything working in tandem, because even if everything flipped tomorrow and we immediately started building perfectly, we're a generation away from seeing everything kind of come together where we've got everything in the right place. But we've got a lot of homes that aren't new that we need to try and retrofit now and make changes to now to where we can really reduce that wildfire risk.
Yeah, I've been talking to real estate agents and to building contractors. And one of the things that I've been really trying to communicate is that we need to get in the habit of expressing this work as a part of the general description of the marketability of the house. It's not just about the remodeled kitchen and the updated furnace. It's, often you'll see, new roof, new flooring, new kitchen. Well, and it also should say, fuels managed, home hardened, or, whatever we want to call it, fireproofing. I mean, I think we still need, language matters, and I think home hardening is still a little bit of a funky term. I think we're going to have to come up with something that people can relate to a little better in this space. But this is just as important as all those other details, and in some ways they can be harder and more daunting to tackle as a new homeowner. And so, maybe the remodeled kitchen is perfect, but but on the other hand, maybe you want to put your own personal finishing touches on that, and this
Yeah.
other stuff at the exterior elements of the building and the fuels around the building. That stuff's maybe harder in the end, and so
Hmm.
um, just to try and recognize how to express this stuff and protect clients and protect the investment and the monetary value we have, because
Yeah.
for most of us our wealth is tied up in our
Hmm.
homes, and
Right.
we don't need to realize that, but at some point we do, and we need to protect that asset as best as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the biggest investments that many people will make in a lifetime, purchasing a home, 30, 40, 50 year, however long. But
Hmm.
yeah, that's certainly something that we have to consider kind of from the get go to really get that awareness becoming a more regular thing. So, and we talked about regulation in California. I mean, we've been interacting with a lot of states across the West. We know California is kind of, leading the charge right now, but we know that there are other states that are making a lot of changes. We've had a lot of engagements with partners in Colorado and Oregon. They have legislation as well that's put into place. I mean, working with our Wildfire Prepared Home designation program on both of those fronts, trying to expand that. It's currently only available in California, but we're seeing a lot of momentum in other states. Has that kind of been your view as well? I know we've got Utah out there, which also is, deals with wildfires too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to watch what's happening in Oregon and their successes and challenges. I mean, they're trying to do a lot in a really
Hmm.
short amount of time period, where, you compare it to California. We've got this thought about fuel management at the home level. We call it defensible space, being on the books
Hmm.
since 1965, right? So
Yeah.
we've got, some socialization and some familiarity with that term for a long time, and trying to supercharge that and fast track it in other states is, I think, going to be ambitious. I know
Hmm.
that, often people are like, well, what is the public backlash going to be? And it's like,
Yeah.
at some point, the palatability is important, but the
Hmm.
enormity of the challenge is so significant. This isn't trivial stuff. This really is, as you said, an existential crisis, and figuring out how we adapt and live in an environment that is fire prone, and get out of the kind of cognitive disbelief that it can't happen here. The sooner we do that, the better off we'll all be. And I've
Right.
talked to enough families and enough folks that have been devastated by wildfire, and it's a multi-generational loss. And
Hmm.
the societal impact is so significant that it's worth the investment, and it's really worth holding everyone's hand and walking them through this and saying, it's great you have insurance, that's a great climate mitigation strategy, but insurance isn't going to repair everything. And we really need to figure out what is within our control, and what we can do to be a good partner with the insurance industry to invest in, a good partner within our community, so that our volunteer fire departments, as well as our professional and paid services, know that that when they travel down the road to your place, it's going to be a safe place to stay and defend, that
Yeah.
they're going to be safe there, and that most of the work has taken place. Because ultimately, coming back to the kind of science side of me, we talk about fire in
Hmm.
a fire triangle perspective, and fire
Right.
behavior is a product of topography, weather, and fuels. Well, the only thing we can do on the topographical choice is decide where we're going to build our home. The weather piece, maybe we can choose a climate that we like, but the piece that we really can manage is that fuel equation. And in our historical records, we've seen drier times without the same intensity of wildfire that we're currently
Hmm.
having right now. So it's an all and. I mean, we need to better steward our ecosystems. We need to better steward our properties, and we really need to just accept that that's the cost of living in this glorious place called the Western United States. Um, and I'm quite confident that with good information, people can make wise decisions and can begin to incorporate this kind of work in a regular routine that becomes part of the annual cycle of taking care of the property, taking care of the family,
Hmm.
and finding some joy in all of that.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right, and it is an all and problem. And we've seen fire also now starting to interact more with our built environment. We know that fire is a natural part of our ecosystem, but when we now have communities that are nestled in that into the wildland, we have this wild and urban interface, right? We've got this
Mm-hmm.
interface between what's happening in the wildland, where there previously might have been nothing, and now there's a community. So it's those gradients where the changes in landscapes happen that we're starting to see some of those negative impacts. And so with that, I want to transition into a little bit of the work that you've done. I know coming up here in November, we're going to have the 5-year anniversary of the Camp Fire, which destroyed the community of Paradise, California, and was one of the state's deadliest wildfires. But let's talk about some of your work that you did there, and we're going to highlight 2 fires here over the next couple of minutes if we can. You've already brought up the Tubbs Fire. We had the Oakland Hills Fire back in the early 1990s, but Camp Fire 2017 coming up on the 5-year. And then also we want to hit the Marshall Wildfire, because that's something that both IBHS and you have done work on in both of those fires. So we'll start with the Camp Fire first. And I kind of want to ask, what was it that happened in this town that caused so much of the town to burn, to be destroyed?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I want to acknowledge that I got the privilege of a local community member, Zeke Lunder, brought myself and Dr. Steve Quarles in, as well as Dr. Eric Knapp from the Forest Service, and we got in on the ground and started looking at some early things that we were curious about, and that led us to actually doing a pretty detailed analysis to try and understand the effect of the California Building Code, because there were 140 or so homes that had been built after the adoption of the wildland urban interface component of exterior building performance. So that's what really got us in there. The Camp Fire is just a horrific story. It took place in November. I often ask people in November, what time if a fire starts at 5:30 in the morning or 6:30 in the morning, can you see the smoke column? And in November you can't, right? And it was a power line that came down. We knew that there were red flag warnings that day, but it was the end of the shoulder season. And I remember being in Arcata, where I live on the coast, and the needles from the redwood trees were just crispy. And on the coast, you don't experience that very often. So sure enough, we had an ignition, wind driven, and within just a few hours, we had spot fires across basically every major artery in Paradise. And yes, there were fuels in the forest land that were sufficient to carry the fire, but that wind was really what was the primary culprit, and that created spot fires. It brought embers that landed on buildings, found ways to get inside buildings, and also ignite fuels adjacent to buildings. And so what you see when you step back and you look at it is that once the homes engaged, and they engaged pretty darn early, that you had an urban conflagration at that point, and you had huge heat load that was produced, and many times there might have just been a surface fire working through town. There are certainly some places where the fire crowned out, but in most cases it was really building to building spread. And so it was a combination of embers from the vegetation, as well as we assume some level of construction related embers, which are different in shape and different in the BTU capacity that they can hold on to, so they can really be more effective in creating new ignitions. From our work, what we learned, we were really curious what was the strongest driver of building survival or loss, and it was really the distance to the nearest destroyed is what we found, and to the nearest destroyed structure. It wasn't just homes, and the number we came up with from a statistical perspective was 54 feet. So if your home or a subject home was within 54 feet of another lost building, there was a super high probability that the building would fail. So that's really what drove it. And I think a lot about it from just like there's a shadow effect. Once you start getting, an ignition in one location, it can spread very quickly and act as a contagion, throughout a community. So, a lot of folks had managed a lot of fuels, had done a lot of things, but even though the lot sizes were large, the average lot size is over an acre in Paradise, but a lot of them are long and skinny, and so still buildings can be close to each other. And, so our findings, so that's, one wildland example, are really important and relevant to the work that's happening at the Insurance Institute and that structure separation experiment that we referenced very early on, because trying to figure out at what point do we really start to, require or advocate for, greater mitigations between buildings. What is that distance that we need to think about? And I think we've all been sort of operationally talking about 30 feet.
Yeah.
But you can see on one tail end that our work found 50 feet. So kind of an interesting data point in this collection of information and that we can use to create better best management practices and strategies to address the issues.
Yeah, that's right. And, as I mentioned, we're going to be having, we've had some tests again already ongoing the last month or two, and then we'll be picking up some others again, I believe, starting next month to look at those and just kind of an overall outline. I mean, we had been seeing, looking at some of those critical distances, right, 20, 30 plus feet, and trying to work back and forth and trying wood structures next to a home or metal structures next to a home. Is it facing a window? Is it at a perpendicular 0-degree angle, or is it at an oblique angle, like 45 degrees? So we're trying to see, because we know that in a neighborhood, we've got all the different juxtapositions of structures near each other, varying distances, varying angles. And we also know that wind interacts with that. So that's one of the unique abilities of our test chamber, is that we can look at what the flow coming out of the chamber looks like without any structures at all. Well, now what does it look like with a house? Now what does it look like with another structure? Well, now let's light that structure on fire and do it again. So it's this repeatability, right? That there's so many different variables, and it really does take that community of researchers and on the ground work that's really helping us to learn more and trying to make some of those decisions moving forward to try and figure out what those critical spacings are. And, you mentioned the structure distances, also some of those connective fuels as well between the properties. But how also did the age of construction and the codes at which those homes were built to, how did that impact some of the survivability rates you saw?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The beauty from a scientific perspective of the campfire, and this sounds totally cold and heartless, and if anyone is a survivor of the campfire, please know that I don't think about it in that way. They are real homes and real lives that were involved. But there was pretty much a continuous burn window, and there was relatively little fire response. So you have, in many respects, a well-designed experiment, one that you would never want to truly deploy, but it gives you a chance to kind of look at how do buildings perform on their own with relatively little intervention. So what we saw is that all the older homes basically were around 12 to 15% in survivability. You don't see increases in survivability until basically the last 20 years of construction. And so then you end up with about 35 to 38% survivability. And then in the last decade, which is after the adoption of the Chapter 7 building code, we had 42% survival. That was not statistically significant of the previous decade, but it shows an increasing trend. And I think the lesson that I take from that is that when you look at age of construction, you don't really know what the condition of the roof is. You don't know if you've got the original roof, if it was replaced 30 years ago, replaced 40 years ago. You don't really know exactly what's happening on those structures. But buildings and homes built in the last 20 years, you can still assume that they probably have their original roof on them, and they're still within their period of performance. And so, we do know that the roof shoulders the majority of the responsibility for protection of the building. And so, increasing survivorship of buildings that are newer and are still within their service life of their roof, to me, is a really key ingredient. We also know that most people are installing double pane windows in the last two decades. So that's, an increase. And then, fiber cement siding has become more common in the last couple of decades. It's not as exclusive. But so there's some elements of the construction materials that we're using, as well as sort of modern construction techniques that I think are coming to play, and we can see that. What Paradise said to me is that there's still improvement in the building code, and there are things that we can do to refine that. And we were really testing it at the building code at its infancy, in essence, right? The very, very first version, because it comes on the books in 2008. And building codes are going to adapt and evolve through time, and I think we're going to get a better handle on the radiant heat issues. The other thing that Paradise doesn't have as an advantage is it doesn't have Zone 0 at play, right? Because that's not on the books yet. And so, I clearly saw lots and lots of fuels around homes. And so I'm very optimistic about, the deployment of the new building code plus Zone 0 and how those two are going to interact. And I think borrowing some of the terms from the last podcast you guys did on Lahaina with Ian was talking about, a number of the ingredients. And, if you had 3 of the 5 ingredients, the probability of survival increases significantly. I think that's what we're going to start to see in California. The question is, can we supercharge that to retrofit existing structures to also, be in that space? And, I'm optimistic with good information, and it'll be in their self-interest to try and do some of those things.
Yeah, for sure. And I know in the town of Paradise, and I mentioned earlier that we launched our wildfire prepared home designation program last year. It was in the state of California, but we launched in Paradise with a homeowner who her home perished in the fire. She was able to build back a new home in another part of the city, and she became our first wildfire prepared home designation. It was a base designation. Now, while it was new construction, that's really the best opportunity, from the work that we are doing. It's a great opportunity for you to retrofit your home too. And it's going to include things like that zone 0 and creating that defensible space, that non-combustible moat of protection essentially around the property. And we also have our plus designation, which is really geared towards new construction, where you can, if you're going to start from the ground up, you can do it right. Now, we have had some homes though that have retrofitted to that. So it is possible, but I think getting solutions like that and others in place to really try and make a difference now to the retrofit idea, because as I mentioned earlier, right, we could build all new homes perfectly good starting tomorrow, but we still got time before we start seeing that meaningful uptake and starting spreading out into more of those communities. So there's certainly some good work happening in communities, and I think I agree with you. As we've seen these improvements in the codes coming forward, I am optimistic that as we start to incorporate things like the defensible space, as well as that the how the structure is built, what the materials we're using, I think that we are going to continue to see hopefully some improvement there in that regard. So we've talked kind of about the campfire, and then I wanted to turn next to the Marshall Fire, which we saw the images of the campfire, which were quite devastating to see so much of the community go up in flames. And that one, when you're thinking about wildfire, you think about this community nestled in the wildland, right? That was Paradise. Marshall, Colorado was a different landscape. It was different fuel type altogether. There wasn't a forest with lots of terrain, lots of topography that were involved in that. This was a grassland fire. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the differences. But first, kind of, what did you find in the Marshall Fire that was different from the campfire and how it unfolded?
Yeah, and I think this is a really sort of terrific line of thinking, because every fire has its own flavor, and every fire has its own kind of signature, and there's some formula to a sort of loss that I think we're generally talking about. But what variable becomes more important in kind of the stepwise progression has been really, it's good to get on the ground and see that firsthand. So when we were talking about the campfire, it was a lot of fine fuels that are associated with the conifer overstory and the oak woodland overstory, and it was the fall, and it was a period of when trees drop their leaves, and so there were a lot of fine fuels around, which meant that we saw more gutter fires, and there was a lot of receptivity in terms of what was surrounding the buildings and for embers. You move to the backside of the Rocky Mountains where people are in the open plains, and it's a totally different story. Because how do you create privacy and security in an environment where you're just on the plains and you're more or less exposed to each other? And then you get a grassland fire. So these two come together. I'll connect them in a second. You get a grassland fire with embers that really don't last very long. They self-extinguish pretty quickly. But grass is receptive, of course. But you get this grassland fire with high winds, and even higher than they were in the campfire. And the embers move forward, and what they end up doing is they end up slamming into fences and falling to the base of the fence. And there's a few collected leaves and debris that you'll see at the base of a wooden fence, and you can get ignition in that. And what we saw was that this was a fire about the connectivity of our privacy that's made through this labyrinth of wood fences in these very suburban communities. And I kind of understood that intuitively, but until I saw it, to see that basically the way that we've interconnected our buildings from neighbor to neighbor to neighbor, we created these natural fuses that could wick fire from one building to the next. So grassland embers, which don't travel too far, aren't super successful, but they can find other grass, create more ignition in grass, and that grass ran into the fences, and then the fences just brought fire to each of these structures. So it wasn't a fire of gutters, and the vents only become weakened in that point once you get construction-related embers, because they weren't really, the grassland embers weren't really successful in penetrating the vents. So kind of a different signature, but one that's super controllable. Yes, we can still maintain that labyrinth of fences, but we just need to disconnect them towards the point of attachment to the buildings. And not very expensive. You can add a gate that can be metal, as an example. You could add a different panel that's made of a non-combustible material if you don't want to add a gate. And these are not expensive things to change overall. A little sweat labor, certainly. And I talk a lot about there's huge room for innovation in the gate design space right now. Like, you can't just go to your local big box hardware or building supply store and find this great collection of beautiful gates that you might want to pop in. But these are the simple details that people can make a big difference with. So had Paradise had more modern vents, that would have been great. Had they maybe used some gutter covers to prevent some of those fires right at the roof edge, which the roof edge is a real vulnerable location. Had fences been disconnected in the Marshall fire, these are the kinds of things that I think are very achievable. And like last night, I was giving a program in a little rural community on the east side of the Sierras, and one of the fire chiefs who was in the room walked up to me afterwards and he said, "Thank you for bringing practical and at least and low expense solutions to this community. People need to hear that there are things that they can do that are quite achievable, and it's great to see that there's science that backs that up."
Yeah, and I think that also that is an empowering thing, right? To be able to tell homeowners. That's something we're keenly focused on here, is telling people that you're not powerless. There are things you can do to protect your home from the perils that impact them, and that includes wildfire. And there are solutions, and they're achievable solutions. And we consider that too when some things are harder than others. Sometimes it is an easier fix, a lower cost thing, and sometimes it's a little bit more energy to do that. But it's trying to find, how can we make the biggest change now, and when do we need to make that transition and say, like, okay, we've made as many little changes that we can, but when do we need to step it up and do the big things too? So I think it's, to your point, finding the right balance there, as that fire official was telling you.
Exactly. And that's really what I try and leave people with, is that there's reason for hope in this. Like, we really have a much clearer understanding of what is happening in the building performance space. Now that we know that, we can do direct action to address those issues, and the mitigations are within our control. And once we start amplifying that and putting them in place at scale, we're going to make a really substantial change in the outcome of both the individual home as well as the broader community. And so, with some information and detangling it, because I think most people feel like, oh my gosh, it's so overwhelming. Where do I start? It's all terrible. There's nothing I can do. In large part, I think that we get so fascinated about these extreme events, and we get so into the drama of it that, we really, through our media messages, just share the tragedy, the horror, and, the impossibility of success. And, that sensationalism has some appropriateness, but it's also, we need to then take it and put it into the empowered place, and to be able to share, what are the successes like in Lahaina with a red roof building, and what exactly, are the elements of success, and how do we put those into practice and provide evidence that it's possible.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point, and it's a perfect timing as well, because I wanted to transition into some of the more specific education efforts that you're involved in, your boots on the ground efforts. But, being a former broadcast meteorologist, it was something that, something happens in a community, reporters go out to basically document and share the people stories and see what's happening, and see, to your point, the scale of what has happened, and to show how this storm or fire has changed people's lives. But it's important to talk about those stories of survival, and how people and communities like pulling themselves back together and rebuilding. It's also, what can we learn from these events? What were the successes, whether they were intended or accidental successes? We're like, I didn't know that worked. Like, yes, it worked. And here's a whole system that's built around mitigation actions like this. So I think it's in these unfortunate events, it's using those to learn to do better the next time, because we all want to try and prevent loss. We are here at IBHS to prevent avoidable loss, and we want to do that for communities and all perils that they face. So as we kind of transition into that, let's talk about some of the work that you're doing, because you just said one example, you're talking to a small rural community yesterday about fire mitigation. So let's talk about some of the efforts that you're doing.
Yeah, well, I'm really enjoying what opportunities I have right now. I've got a few of the resources to work with communities throughout California, even though my geographic assignment is off in the northwest corner of the state. I'm really trying to work to stand up a new cohort of folks in California that have expertise in this wildland and built space, and then I'm also trying to support. The state has hired a whole bunch of new people that work with fire safe councils. And so, I'm trying to help support developing a qualified workforce to work in this space, to have, the ability to have people in your community to hold your hand through these difficult and challenging, adaptation, adoption strategies. And so that gives me the opportunity to work with small communities. It gives me the opportunity to speak before large audiences. I work, a lot, as I mentioned, in policy, and I serve as a technical resource for folks that are interested in exploring some of these topics, and trying to lend what wisdom I've been able to garner through the years, and sort of the systems viewpoint that I have on how you operationalize a lot of this work. In my job, I've also been a department head, and so I've sat in county government and at the table with all the other department heads in county government. So I've got this kind of wildland side, this county government side, and then this fire side, and I try and lace that together with the human connection, the sociological way that people adopt and take in information, and really try and bring a message that there is reason for hope. There are things that we can do. There is action that's within our control that can make a difference, and you won't regret it. So I've been working at many scales, through virtual events to in-person events, and then continuing to try and develop and deliver a research program that continues to advance what we know.
Yeah, and that's great work. And we talked about kind of diversifying the message, right? Because you're talking to different people from different walks of life who have had different experiences, and also like how do we talk to them? We know that while the physical science, the mitigation science of the structure and the fuels around the structure are important, but it's also the social science and how people receive the information that we're giving them. Just because I go up to somebody and be like, hey, did you know this? And you'll be like, yeah, get out of here. I don't even know who you are, whatever. What right do you have to tell me about anything? You don't even live there. So I think it's a fine line that we walk, right? We have to understand people in order to reach them. We can't just go in there with a canned message and say like, oh, well, this is what you need to do, and it works for everybody, right? It's the same thing from like an evacuation plan or a response plan. One size does not fit all. And that's important in the messaging too.
Yeah. You got to meet people where they're at. I use this one image where it's a covered trailer with this gorgeous vista in the backdrop, and and there's these huge gaps. There's fuel all over it, and I'll put it on a slide, and I'll talk to communities about, well, what do you say when you meet this homeowner? And they usually go, well, gosh, it looks pretty terrible. And I say, you know what? You live in the most amazing spot in the world. Look at that view you have. You must be so
lead with the positive.
You must be so glad to wake up every morning and see that view. And you just gotta figure out how to connect and appreciate everybody's piece of paradise, and then try and figure out what's on their mind, what are they thinking about, and then it's a both end. Maybe you can weasel in some of the homework that can be done to help them prepare for fire better, or just get them signed up for the alerts, because maybe there's so much work to be done that it's going to be a daunting task and it's going to take a while. So let's just make sure you know how to get information, and you also know how to read the clouds and the fire weather and the smoke to be able to anticipate that, oh, this is a hazardous situation. This is something I need to do. I need to make a change in, or I need to get myself out of here.
Yeah, and I think as science communicators, it's we're not trying to be callous and say like, oh, well, we're just trying to figure out, what makes you tick so that we can get you to do what we want you to do. It's because we firmly believe and know that the science that is showing here are the actions that can really make a difference for you. I want to give you those, but I want to also understand you, to understand your concerns, why you may or may not be receptive to it, what are the challenges, because that's going to help us to apply the solutions. We might have the best solutions, but if we can't understand people, like you said, meet them where they are and communicate that, we're not going to make that progress, because even if they don't know it, there might be options out there to prevent suffering for them or someone they know down the line. So that's why it all does play together, and there's a purpose in it, and it is all to just try and make things better for people going forward, whether they know they're at risk or not.
Right. And what you might assume is maybe not true. So, you got to take the time to understand the person, understand what they bring to the table, what they're challenged by, and how we can, surround them with resources to help address their vulnerabilities if they're ready.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if they're not, wait till they are. It's all about, who's the trusted messenger, and fortunately I work in a place where I'm not a regulator, and so I don't bring any risk of a visit, but I look for those opportunities to make a difference, because the bottom line is I care about people, I care about communities, and I really want to see everyone put on the best position possible so that we can avoid tragedy.
Absolutely. And now, as we have our last couple minutes here, there is an effort that you're involved in the state of California. We said that you're very involved in the state and a lot of things that they're doing. So tell us about this, the California's Risk Modeling Work Group. You're a member of that. Tell us a little bit about what that group does and how you're kind of working to address some of the challenges that they're facing in the wildfire space.
Right. So it's a great question. The legislature asked that a couple things occur over the next couple of years. One was, to create a couple of committees. And the Risk Modeling Work Group is a subcommittee of the Wildfire Mitigation Committee. And it's a group of people that have some expertise to lend to the equation. And so we've been meeting for, at least the last year or so, trying to find common ground, trying to find common perspective. And we've got a draft of a report that is about to go out. And it's pretty important stuff right now, because we're, talking a lot about how to solve some of the insurance challenges in California. And there's a lot of interest in catastrophe models, and whether catastrophe models would be a key element to bring to the equation. And so our work group has been trying to just really concatenate or pull together the variety of resources that are at play, and the kind of approaches that different communities are taking, and to understand what different organizations bring to the table relative to modeling and data collection. And I think we're just really advisory to the insurance commissioner, to the legislature. And what we'll offer is, I think, a launching point for some next level of a deep dive into that topic. And we've seen the insurance space is really dynamic right now in California, and there's a lot more interest in catastrophe models and what role they may play. And the insurance commissioner has been holding some hearings to explore that. And so that report will contribute to some of that space, and hopefully help us think through some of the issues. There's not a huge, big ta-da that comes out the other side of the report, except for that, we really need to socialize, I think, the understanding of risk and hazard, and what data we can collect, and come to some more kind of operational agreements around what data means what, and what's the transparency around that data, what's the system of collection with some uniformity, and the system of interpretation of that data. And because right now it's a lot of opaqueness in that space. And I, for me, like, how can, as a homeowner, can I best, contribute to people perceiving my place as a place worth investing in from an insurance space? How can I demonstrate that I've done the right stuff? And so, working from that scale to the policymaker, to the insurer scale, so that we're all speaking the same language and everyone knows what dials to turn.
Right. And yeah, that's true. And you spoke to that about, the challenges that the market is facing now. I mean, California is I believe it's the largest property insurance market by premium in the country, if not the world. It's pretty up there if I got the statistic right there. But we know that there are a lot of challenges, and we know, as you referenced, the commissioner, Commissioner Lara, they instituted their regulation last year, talking about insurance discounts for homeowners who have made some steps towards mitigation. And so it's really this partnership of getting the homeowners to understand, what mitigation efforts can I do now to reduce my risk and properly. And one, how do I even understand my risk, right? You talked about it in the catastrophe modeling space, and just understanding what risk is to begin with and how the homeowner can respond to that. And thus, how can the insurer respond to that? And everything can kind of work in tandem so that we can make it the best system for everyone involved. And I know that the governor just issued an executive order just last week, trying to address some of the challenges that we're facing across the state in the wildfire and insurance space. And then Commissioner Lara also made some commitments there, looking through over the next year or two. So there's a lot of momentum in the state of California, as we've talked about today. So I'm optimistic going forward that all of the information that is coming together, and knowing that this is a multifaceted problem that requires multifaceted solutions and groups coming together, and finding what the balance needs to be in all of these different areas to try and improve the landscape for everyone.
Precisely. I mean, it's a really dynamic time, and we're working through it in California. And ask me in 6 months where we're at, because it will be somewhere different than we are right now. And
Right.
I think that the bottom line is that people are becoming more conversant. The vocabulary is increasing. We're understanding how the system was developed in California, what the role and value and limitations that each of the departments have, and we've got propositions that influence policy that. You can't change a proposition without another proposition. So it becomes complex that, you arrange a system, and then, some years later, the system doesn't quite fit for the issues of the time, and you can't anticipate all of those needs. So, what I'm referring to is that Proposition 103, I think written in 1989, 88, somewhere in there,
88, yeah.
Says that we should look backwards, for past performance should be the way we predict future rate structures. And there's a lot of interest in trying to be able to use predictive modeling and catastrophe modeling to help inform that risk evaluation. And so we're trying to figure out how to thread that needle and bring all available information so that there's clear transparency and people understand what the risks are. And I think there's just a lot to detangle, especially because we've so related wildfire with forest fire. And the greatest risk being in forests. And I think it's more complex than that. We lose lots of homes in fires that don't have that many forests. And so, like, rechanging the narrative and being very specific about what the risks that trees provide or don't provide, and the amenity values that they provide, and this whole landscape of challenges and issues. So Mediterranean ecosystems are particularly tricky. We have a long prolonged drought period, and then we have a more precise wetting period, and as things shift around, we're struggling with trying to understand all of that stuff.
Yeah. And like you said, we're working together, and we're learning every day. And so I think we're gonna, if we keep this model going forward, we're hopefully gonna end up in a good space down the road. So, well, Yana, we're gonna wrap up our discussion today, and I thank you so much for taking the time with us. This has been a really enlightening discussion, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as well. We've kind of covered a lot of ground here, kind of talking about sort of how you got into the industry, and we've learned from fires, and we learned about mitigation and education. So, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Oh, you bet. It's wonderful to be with you all, and thank you very much for the work that you all do at the Insurance Institute and for the partnership. And it's it's great to have so many players working directly on this issue, and us collaborating across all spectrums. So thank you very much.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you for your efforts as well. And thank you to our listeners. We hope that you will join us next time for the Disaster Discussions podcast. And until then, we hope you have a safe day, and just keep a weather eye on the horizon.
Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast, an IBHS production. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app, or watch the podcast on our website at ibhs.org/disaster discussions podcast and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety YouTube channel. Connect with us on our social media pages on Twitter at Disaster Safety, Facebook at facebook.com/disaster safety, and on Instagram at IBHS_org. For more great content from IBHS, including ongoing research efforts happening at our facility, episodes of our podcast, and more, visit ibhs.org.